So thank you, Ken, to accept to participate in this dialogue, this South-North dialogue on democracy, development, and sustainability. So our theme here is we're going to talk a little bit about intellectual property rights and the pandemic. So I'm here with Ken Shadlin. Ken is professor of development studies in the Department of International Development of the London School of Economics and Political Science. In recent years, Ken's research has focused largely on global and cross-national politics of intellectual property. He's interested in the implications of the new global intellectual property regime presents for late development and the various ways that international norms for IP affect national practices. His most recent book, Coalitions and Compliance, The Political Economy of Pharmaceutical Patents in Latin America, analyzes differences of how countries introduced pharmaceutical patents in the 90s and then subsequently revised their new pharmaceutical patent systems in the 2000s. So Ken also works on the political economy of health and pharmaceutical policies, the dynamics of North-South trade agreements, and changing patterns of government business relations and democratization. He was also one of the managing editors of the Journal of Development Studies from 2011 to 2020. He has a PhD and a master's in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. He was also recently the head of the Department of International Development at the LSE, and was my advisor when I made my post-PhD research at LSE from 2017 to 2018. So I'm going to talk with him. I'm a professor of UFABC, the Federal University of ABC in Brazil. I'm also the vice coordinator of World Political Economy graduate program at the same university. I founded and I'm coordinating now an interdisciplinary research group called Ação Covid-19, Action COVID-19, which combines scientific research and social activism to combat the spread of the new coronavirus in Brazilian cities. So I have a PhD in economics at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, and my research interests are now the pandemic, of course, complexity models, political economy, intellectual property rights, and value theory. So thanks again, Ken, for your presence. So let's talk a little bit about intellectual property rights and the pandemic. So we need to introduce the theme a little bit. So I'm going to read this introduction, okay, for about 3 minutes. And then I'm going to ask you 4 main questions and maybe sub-questions to guide the debate. So we know that after the 80s, the process of productive and financial internationalization has intensified, covering the majority of the countries. So new economic and political arrangements led by transnational corporations and states reorganized global flows of knowledge, goods, services, and capital. One of the WTO's agreements that we call TRIPS, that is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, can be largely related to this change in the productive and financial process. So related to the emergence and economic importance of new technology sectors such as biotech, ICT, or the pharmaceuticals industry. We know that TRIPS and the post-TRIPS agreements have been a fielding dispute. So, it's being that way in this context of the hegemonic dispute between the United States and now the emergence of the Chinese state, the Chinese economy, as well as the competition in the vanguard technological sectors. So, in one hand, it's a common sense. I don't think we agree on that, but the majority of the academy thinks that there are opposition between different blocks of countries. So in one hand, new economic sectors backed by rich countries or not, see TRIPS as insufficient. So to reinforce their position, their economic position. And on the other side, developing countries or enterprises, corporations in these developing countries, like poor and middle-income countries, demand or not, depending on the political orientation of the country, more openness and competition to access or participate in strategic innovative sectors such as climate change technologies, telecommunications, the so-called Industry 4.0, biotech, and so on. So the COVID-19 pandemic brought these contradictions to the surface as intellectual property rights by helping to develop global value chains and cooperation, help it also to, so the contradiction is intellectual property rights are helping to develop global value chains and cooperation between countries, enterprises, but also are imposing greater costs to poorer countries and poorer citizens in rich countries as well, in terms of access to goods indispensable to fighting the virus, such as pharmaceutical products like vaccines, medical and hospital instruments, telecommunication services that are important to deal with the pandemic. And also the counterpart of it, great gains to transnational corporations and indirectly to rich countries and rich citizens. So with this context, let's think about those processes, focusing on the international agreements of intellectual property in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. So Ken, first, sorry about my English. It's a little bit rust as I'm not practicing it. So, but let's start to talk. So we have four main questions. I'm going to ask you the first, and then we can develop the talk. So the first question is, what are the main productive, technological, and financial transformations in process? But this question is more related to the 4.0 industry, but we could like re-question this, asking the importance of intellectual property in recent productive, technological, and financial transformations in the globalized economy. So what do you think about this? Does intellectual property feel important, not? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So intellectual property has always been most important in sort of the pharmaceutical space. It's where it matters the most. And I think that's still true. It matters, the intellectual property tends to matter the most in areas where the inventors don't have other ways to protect their inventions. And so there's a long body of research on this dating back to some very influential surveys that were done with managers of big firms, 40 years ago, asking them, what are all the different ways that you protect your inventions? And the sector that most reports, oh, we rely on intellectual property rights, is the pharmaceutical sector. It's not the only one, but it's the most. So I think that's a constant here. What I think is different now is that typically when we've talked about intellectual property in pharmaceuticals, most of our discussions have been about the regular sorts of pharmaceutical products, the pills and stuff that we get at the pharmacy, the things that to put it simply, the kinds of medicines that you take orally. And intellectual property is particularly important there because those are easy to imitate. Where I think things are changing a bit is that so much of the discussion about pharmaceuticals and COVID in this pandemic has been around vaccines, and most of the analyses of intellectual property in pharmaceuticals until a year ago were just not about vaccines. So there's a huge body of literature, people who have been writing about intellectual property in the pharmaceutical industry for years and years and years. I mean, I'm one of those people, but we've always been writing about sort of orally taken drugs. We just haven't been writing about vaccines. And so vaccines brings up a whole different sets of issues.
Okay.
So I think that's a big change from what we've typically looked at.
Okay, but what the focus on vaccines change what subject or what?
Well, the focus on
what direction?
It in some ways might make intellectual property, at least the patents side of intellectual property, less important than it is. Because normally with a regular drug, if you've invented a regular drug and I am a pharmaceutical firm, I can make it.
Okay.
There aren't technological barriers. There aren't manufacturing barriers that prevent me from making the exact same drug. That's why we have generic medicines. The only thing that's preventing me from making it, well, there's two things that are preventing me from making it. One is the patent, and the other one might be some sort of regulatory exclusivity, where even if I can make it, and even if you don't have a patent, your health regulator says for this time period, I'm only going to allow one product on the market. But a lot of countries don't have that sort of regulatory exclusivity. Brazil doesn't, for example. So the only thing that would matter would be the patent for regular drugs. For vaccines, even if you don't have a patent, I'm going to have trouble making it. And I'm certainly going to have trouble making it at scale. And so it's not enough just to remove the patent. I also have to have more access to information and knowledge that you have that's not available. And so the patent itself doesn't provide. The way to think about it is that with regular drugs, if you remove the patent, it's really easy for generic firms to enter very quickly. And with vaccines, it might be that the patent is keeping some of the generic imitators out, but it's not the only thing keeping them out, because even if you remove the patent, they're going to have trouble getting in.
Okay. So what you're saying is that maybe the patent or this type of intellectual property is less important than the knowledge to make the vaccines as fast as they can, or the industrial secrets or something like that.
Yeah, a lot of the discussion has been about what people call trade secrets, or other people call it sort of, know-how is a term that gets thrown around a lot. But it's other aspects about how to make the product that they are neither disclosed in the patent application, which is kind of irrelevant because nothing disclosed in the patent application really matters. The point is that they're not disclosed in the product. So with a regular drug, I can just take out this. It's a chemical. It's a chemical compound, and I can just figure out what this chemical compound is, and I can make it.
Okay.
Unless the patent stops me. But with vaccines, you can't as easily sort of reverse engineer it just based on the information that you have from staring at the product. You need to have more of the manufacturing knowledge and know-how.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, look, but we are in a globalized world, so, and the access of information is available. I think the information is available. A lot of people are like studying everywhere and learning how to do, and the information are more fluid. So even in this kind of world that idealistically any country can have a bunch of people like knowing how to do, you think there are these barriers because of the technological, I don't know, investment that one huge enterprise corporation needs to do to invent something?
I think that they could figure it out. I think if you give them enough time, they'll figure it out. There's two issues here: is how long it will take them to figure it out, and we don't usually. That's another way that the pandemic has brought about a transformation. Is we don't usually care about how long it takes somebody to figure it out. If you get your new cholesterol-lowering generic drug on the market now, or takes you another year to get it on the market, I mean, that matters, but it doesn't matter as much as it matters for, like, with vaccines, we need lots of them we care about time. So in the case of a pandemic, sort of speed is really important. There's also issues of scale. Like, yeah, they'll figure it out, but part of the manufacturing is figuring out how to manufacture massive amounts of it. And most pharmaceutical products are not made in such massive amounts. So don't get me wrong. There are smart people and smart sort of biochemists all over the world. Anybody could figure out how to make these products. The point is that figuring out how to make them at scale and speed and the necessary speed is different for vaccines than it is for normal pharmaceuticals. That's really the point. It's more challenging. Okay,
that's a good point. So let's talk a little bit in this inside this main question. So do you think that like TRIPS provisions are losing like strength? It's not that important to pharmaceuticals or other new technology sectors that are emerging? You can risk something on that, or?
So no, I still think the TRIPS provisions are important, partially because we're not going to be living in a pandemic forever. So I think they sort of reduced part of my feelings about why they have less importance right now is because of the conditions that are set by the fact that we're living in a pandemic. But in normal times, we don't care as much about speed or scale. And therefore, the TRIPS provisions could be are much more important. And also, I'm only talking about vaccines. For every other type of health technology, regular drugs, treatments, diagnostics, all that, TRIPS matters for all of that. So my argument that the intellectual property and patents is not sort of the main part of the story right now is quite a constrained argument. It's basically about a certain type of product, vaccines, in a certain period, this pandemic. But for everything else, outside of that little world is very important. But outside of that little world, I think that the TRIPS and the IP provisions still matter and will still continue to matter immensely.
Okay. So, but it's matter to what? Like, that's the last question inside this blow.
No, it matters to the ability of, I like to use the term non-originator, but you can call it generic, follow-on, imitators, whatever you want to call them. It matters the ability of these sorts of firms to be able to produce and get their products on the market. And the reason why we care about that is that the more supply there is, that's what brings prices down. So we want to typically, forget about innovation for a sec, from a health and development perspective, you'd rather have 10 different companies selling the product than one. All right. And so it matters about the extent, it matters for competition.
Okay. Yeah, I provoked like unusual sub question, like so you talk as the TRIPS agreement is the only, like, it's the basic framework on we talk about development and innovation. So can you imagine, like, what would it be a world without any sort of IP protection? Would we have development or less development, or it's possible inside capitalism to advance without IP protection?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways of generating innovations. IP is one of those ways. So it's not the only way. So the idea that if we didn't have intellectual property, we wouldn't have new products is not very convincing, because there are other ways to try to get the products through direct government subsidies, through other types of prizes where if you come up with a product, you get an award. It's just not a patent. So there's other ways to sort of, and again, there's big literatures on this, that we would refer to as the literature on the incentives to innovation. And patents are just one instrument that are meant to create incentives to innovation. But by no means are they the only. Okay. So would we have more development or less? I don't know if we'd have more development or less, but I don't believe that if we didn't, I can imagine a world without IP protection, and I don't know what that world would look like, but I don't necessarily think that it would be a world in which there was no innovation.
Okay. Thank you for those answers. Let's enter in the second main question. And so that's how do the interstate disputes and environmental challenges manifest? So the context is the Industry 4.0 and other things, but I think we could talk a little bit about your recent articles. You made a point. I don't know if I'm resuming this, summing it up adequately. Don't know if I'm right here, but I think you stated that the IP agreements was important to improve cooperation between states and transnational corporations in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. But in my view, I think it also reinforces monopolies and interstate struggles. Do you agree with me? I quoted that state by Oxfam, the global anti-poverty charity, ONG, that the coronavirus vaccine must be free for all. They stated that the pharmaceuticals companies should share their technology and intellectual property. What do you think about that appeal? And what do you think about this question?
So there's a lot there. First of all, I'm not exactly sure what of my work you were referring to, and I think I understand the question you're asking me. So should the vaccine be free for all? Ideally, I'd like the vaccine to be free for all. Frankly, it's close to free for all, and I don't really think price is the big issue here. We're in a terrible situation with vaccines in the world. It's totally unequal but it's not because it costs too much. It's because there's not enough supply. The reason why there's virtually no vaccines in Africa is not because the vaccines are too expensive. That was a problem with HIV/AIDS drugs 20, 25 years ago. They were crazily expensive. The problem isn't the vaccines are too expensive. The problem is there aren't enough vaccines, period. They have the money because they'll get the money from donors, they'll get the money from multilateral development banks, and some of the vaccines are actually being supplied at very low prices. So the problem isn't price, although I agree the vaccines should be free or close to free, but I don't think that's a problem, because I think they largely are. I want there to be the most amount of production. So in a normal year, I'll get to your question. I know it sounds like I'm going a different path, but I'm trying to get to your question. In a normal year, and again, I apologize that I keep on talking about pharmaceuticals and vaccines rather than the whole industry 4.0 and all that other stuff, but I can only talk about the things that I feel like I know something about.
Okay.
In a normal year, the world produces about 4.5, say 5 at the most, billion doses of vaccines for everything, for all pathogens, for all conditions. The world produces about 4 or 5 billion doses of vaccines. In 2021, the world is going to produce probably, we're not there yet, so we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know how good some of these projections are. But the world's probably going to produce somewhere around 7 or 8 billion doses of vaccines for COVID-19. So why do I start with that? Because the problem we have is that there's not enough production. That's the problem. However, you can't have an honest conversation about the lack of production if you don't also acknowledge that, oh, wow, there's been a ton of production. Like, we're producing twice as many vaccines for this one disease that didn't even exist 2 years ago, in humans 2 years ago. We're bringing twice as much than we ever produce of all vaccines for all conditions ever, in a year. So it's possible that two statements can both be true simultaneously. Statement number one, the amount of vaccine production that's going on in the world is astonishing. Statement number two, the amount of vaccine production that's going on in the world is not nearly enough. Both statements, I believe that both statements are completely correct. So the question then is, how can we get more vaccine? Instead of having 7 or 8 billion doses produced this year, having 15 billion doses produced this year. And I think that's where the disagreement is. There's an argument out there that says the way to do that would be to remove the intellectual property and to then let lots of producers produce this, and then we would get from 7 or 8 billion to 15 billion. I actually think we're more likely to get to that higher, that not by removing the intellectual property, but by letting the originators build their production networks, like the way, for example, AstraZeneca has gone into alliance with Fiocruz in Brazil, or Sinovac has gone into alliance with Butantan in Brazil, and a couple of other examples that are taking place. There's not enough of this. So my point isn't that this is working. My point is that I just think we need to do a lot more of that. I don't know if I'm right. I just think that there's good reasons to believe that you're more likely to increase production that way than you are by letting anybody produce it because of some of the difficulties and the reliance, the need for technology transfer and know-how that we were talking about earlier in the conversation.
Okay.
Now, let me just get back to your main question. Is that if you do that, I concede that if you do that, you're going to be strengthening the monopolists. So you're going to basically be entrenching the monopoly power of big pharmaceutical firms. And I don't like that any more than you do, and I don't like that any more than the people at Oxfam do, but I'm willing to accept that as an outcome to get more production.
So it's like as we were in a war economy, but the main productive sector is private, not state owned. Yeah. Something like that. So you need to guarantee their profits, something like that.
Well, you need to get them to produce a lot. For me, it's a question of which battle are you waging? Are you waging the battle against lack of adequate production, or are you trying to also sort of knock the big pharmaceutical firms off their perch and take away some of their power? I don't have a problem with the second. That's just not my priority right now.
Okay, I understood. So just one more question in this section. Do you think that there is a dispute or struggle between the two main economic powers today, like between China and the USA? Because they are very interdependent economies, but we see like in the news, this vaccines race, the vaccine diplomacy, maybe they are examples of this struggle. And there is any implication of this fighting to international intellectual property agreements? What do you?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There's clearly a series of disputes between the U.S. and China, but it's pretty much one direction. I don't think China has a lot of disputes with the U.S. The U.S. has a lot of disputes with China. And it's kind of holding up a lot of the negotiations at the WTO. I'm not sure how it plays out in terms of the vaccine stuff. I mean, you know as well as I do that two of the largest providers of vaccines are both Chinese labs. But we don't know. I mean, in some ways, they're acting a lot like the US and European labs, in that they're selecting their partners and they're forming technology transfer agreements with their selective partners. I mean, the fact that AstraZeneca, Fiocruz's partner, is a European firm, but Sinovac, Butantan's partner, is a Chinese firm, I'm not sure that it really matters. They seem to be acting fairly similarly.
Yeah, I talked with people from Butantan, and they said that the agreement is like a pattern when they sign the intellectual property rights agreements as AstraZeneca with Fiocruz, so not that different. I agree with you on that. So it's going to I think there is going to be any impact in the international agreements. Maybe they're going to profound a little bit because China is now a leader in a lot of sectors. So
yeah.
Okay, so let's start the third block, third section. So what are the distributional consequences of improving or reinforcing IP protection worldwide, including, we can talk about this, including an intersectional standpoint or not. Maybe we can first talk about what are the distributive consequences of COVID-19 crisis and its relation to intellectual property. I think you answered that a little bit, like stating that the monopolies are going to be reinforced. Do you think another thing? Do you want to complement with another thing?
No, I feel like we probably covered that. I mean, there are huge distributional consequences of what we're experiencing now. and I think they're going to stick with us for a long time, maybe, for the rest of the decade at the least, maybe, probably longer. I think that but I'm not sure how much of those distributional consequences are because of the IP itself rather than because, again, as the lack of sufficient production.
Competition. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, or just, I guess my point is that it's not so much competition that I'm looking for, it's more production. So how many, just to stick on this for a sec, Zay, how many Brazilian firms are involved in any way in producing COVID-19 vaccines? Three. That's it. Three. Okay. 2 public and 1 private.
Okay.
Fiocruz, or Biomanguinhos, Butantan, and then União Química is producing, but they're not even making the full vaccine. They're making the final stages of the Sputnik vaccine.
Yeah.
Now go outside of Brazil. How many companies, public or private, in all of Latin America, from the border with the US to Tierra del Fuego, in the entire area, Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, South America, how many firms are involved making COVID-19 vaccines? 8.
8.
Yeah. 3 in Brazil.
1 in Cuba, maybe.
No, I'm talking about making the ones that are already being used. So not not trying to come up with their new ones. So 3 in Brazil, 3 in Mexico, 1 in Argentina, and I am missing. Oh no, 2 in Argentina. That's it. 3 in Brazil, 3 in Mexico, 2 in Argentina.
Okay, 3 countries. Okay.
3 countries, and hardly any firms in these countries. And most of what they're doing is importing the actual drug substance and bottling it. In terms of actual production of the actual drug substance, what we would call the active principle and active pharmaceutical ingredient, right now that's happening in only one place. Like the Brazilians are just learning it. My point is there's not enough of that. And so what I'm actually asking for is not necessarily more competition, but more production, more partnerships. How come Moderna doesn't have a partnership anywhere in Latin America? How come Johnson & Johnson doesn't have a partnership anywhere in Latin America? How come, just like Sinovac has a partnership with Butantan, how come they don't also have a partnership with an Argentinian or a Colombian or a Mexican firm? AstraZeneca has one partnership in Brazil and another partnership for the rest of Latin America. How come every major pharmaceutical firm, vaccine producer, doesn't have 2 partnerships in the region? At least one for Brazil, which is about half of the population, and one for the rest of the region, which is about the other half of the population. We need a lot more of that. So and again, there's 2 ways to get more of that. One is through competition, and one is basically to get the originators to create more partnerships with local firms. But that's what we need. We need a lot more about that. And so I realize we're sort of getting back to the previous question, but that's the problem, and it's creating huge distributional consequences. The vaccination rates in the region are just incredibly low relative to what they are, say, in the US and Europe. And if you go to Sub-Saharan Africa, they're even lower.
Okay. Yeah. So what they are saying basically is that we are the periphery of the system. We are dependent. It doesn't matter if there is any intellectual property international agreement, or you can don't sign it, but you need a national industry. So you need national incentives to produce, to create, to innovate, to create new technology, because without all that, you can do whatever you want with, I don't know, I'm lacking the compulsory license, for example.
Yeah.
That's it. So
Yeah,
we are condemned to be dependent without that. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, you need more national capabilities to produce. Exactly. It's not necessarily to come up with your own product, which is what, for example, the Cubans are trying to do. And also there's a couple of Brazilian labs that are trying to come up with their own vaccines. You need national capabilities just to be like available partners in these collaborations with the originator firms.
Okay. So that brings us the last section. That the last main question is, how can popular solutions or state action alleviate asymmetries? So let's talk a little bit about this. Both examples you gave, like the development of Cuban and Brazilian vaccines. So they are aiming for sovereignty in the whole production process. They can serve as examples of public policies for developing countries or not. So maybe we don't have scale, or
they just need to be able to produce a lot more. So I think it's amazing that Cuba has two vaccines that both appear to have been very successful in clinical trials. So it appears that Cuban labs have come up with two very effective, good vaccines. But we need to have enough doses, not just for the people of Cuba, but we need hundreds of millions of doses for all of Latin America. If they're going to become a major player, we need billions of doses. They can't produce that much.
Yeah. No, they are saying that they are going to produce more vaccines than they need to the Cuban population, maybe like 100 or 200 million doses. And in Brazil, I don't know, Brazil is too big, so I think we're going to produce enough for us, but not for our partners.
So I think I read something like 100 million, but maybe it's 200 million. But remember, not to get too down on this whole party, but remember that both of the Cuban vaccines required 3 doses.
Okay.
So if even if you're making 200 million doses, which I think is not right, I think it's 100 million. But let's be optimistic and say they can make 200 million. So we're basically talking about 66 million people getting vaccinated. That's good. I'd rather have 66 million than not, but that's not solving the problem, right?
Yeah, they're going
what we need is the Cubans to link up with some Brazilian firms. That could be some of the state labs that have capacity, or they could be some of the Brazilian private firms. And just in the same way that Sinovac is linking up with Butantan and AstraZeneca with Biomanguinhos, as we keep on talking about, and have them make it. And we need them to link up with some Argentinian firms. There are firms out there that can make these things in Latin America. So we just need them to start forming partnerships with them. I've been trying to get information on to what extent they're doing that, and I haven't been able to learn anything. But maybe you know more about those plans than I do.
I don't know that much, but I think that it's a different way to approach the solution. Like if Cuba develops like a more open technological path that the third world can produce the vaccines using their own resources, it could be good. I don't know if Butantan has this orientation. They have the orientation to produce vaccines using our Brazilian resources, but I don't know if they have like the Cuban orientation. But I think this could be a solution. I don't know it. I think idealistically, I don't have information like you, so maybe they can provide vaccines for the third world. I don't know. Let's hope they can do. I think you are a little bit skeptic about that. I don't know. I'm a little bit too, but we need to be realistic.
I'm only skeptical today because of the 3-dose problem. It's a lot of vaccines.
Yeah.
Remember also that, I mean, if they were to share all of their knowledge and technology and all of their regulatory data, then it's possible that other producers could make it. Again, I think they would make it more quickly if they had the actual technology transfer, but we don't know. Technology transfer is not costless. And so we also don't know what the Cuban labs' capacities are to transfer their technology. I don't think just basically publishing the information and letting everybody do it is going to be enough. Again, I think you're going to need the active engagement of the originator to help. And that includes if the originator is Cuban, really. I don't think that's so, but we'll see. I think it's really amazing that they've come up with that they've developed these vaccines. Mexico has a vaccine that's very well developed as well. And I know that Butantan has a vaccine, but it's not the only one. There's multiple vaccines coming out of labs in Brazil. Yeah. And so hopefully, some of these will be very successful. And if they're all successful and they all produce 300, 200 million, that'll add up, that'll be good.
Yeah. Just to comment one thing and then discuss with you the other. I think we have time. It's 36 minutes since I started to interview you. So 5 more minutes maybe we can use. So the first thing, I think the 3 doses or 2 doses or 1 dose is not that important because the modeling is telling us that we're going to need this kind of merry-go-round vaccination. You understand, like this. We need to vaccinate everybody in a short period of time during maybe a couple of years, 2, 3 years maybe. So that's the prediction. So I think you are right that we are going to need tens of billions of doses in 2 or 3 years, maybe 20, 30 billions of doses of vaccines. So it doesn't matter if it's 1, 2, or 3 because that's a lot. So that's a lot of vaccines. So that's the first thing. The second, I think that Cuba has this tradition of teaching or spreading their technology. So in public health, maybe in public health, they go all over the world. It's a like state activity. They profit with that. So it's an economic state activity. So they came to Brazil, teach us some issues about public health and the service, the doctor services that they bring here. So I think Cuba maybe is using that as a diplomatic instrument as well. So that's the only thing I would like to add. I
think that's good. I think you're right. I mean, they have a unique tradition in doing that. And so let's be optimistic and think they can do it here as well. I'm not quite as optimistic as you are, but I'm willing to share your enthusiasm for it. Yeah, maybe it would be. Yeah.
Okay. So just to finish, do you think that I would like to talk? Do you want to talk? If you can say no, but do you want to talk about the Biden's administration waiver? They backed the vaccine intellectual property waiver. It was important to the intellectual property world framework, legal framework. Do you think it was an advance to give access and to cooperate more? Do you think it came just as a rhetoric issue? What do you think about that?
So I think it's really interesting. I don't really know why they did it. In and of itself, it doesn't do anything, right? Because it still has to get approved at the WTO, and the U.S. is just one country. Although after the U.S. said they would support it, a lot of other countries that had previously said they wouldn't support it suddenly said they would. So the U.S. is still, for better or worse, a bit of a leader, and a lot of other countries follow. So I think it's interesting. I actually think it's more interesting from a more political sense in that this is, I'm going to go so far as to say this is literally the first time in the 26 years of the TRIPS agreement, 25 years of the TRIPS agreement, that the U.S. has ever supported anything that basically was about sort of reducing IP protection of intellectual property rights in pharmaceuticals. Usually, no matter what the issue is, if it's about reducing the level of protection in pharmaceuticals, the U.S. is no. And here the U.S. said yes. So that's really interesting. I think it's unprecedented. How important it's going to be? I don't know how important it's going to be in terms of the pandemic, but in terms of the broader political economy of intellectual property and pharmaceuticals, I think it potentially is important. And I think that's why the pharmaceutical industry was so upset about it.
Yeah.
Not because of what it means for this, it's what it means for what's going to happen 5 years from now.
Yeah, they were very upset. They didn't support that waiver. But I think you're right. Like it came like with, I don't know, other progressive policies like the minimum income, the answer, like I don't know, US maybe Biden was elected with a progressive platform, so I think it has to do with that. I don't know. I really don't know why he did it. It was internal pressure or to be good in the picture. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think anybody knows. I mean, there's lots of explanations that are out there, but the thing is again, the question is to what extent this is actually that change of position on the U.S. actually matters in terms of the crisis that we're currently experiencing about vaccine production. And I don't see it changing that much by itself. I just think it's interesting from a political perspective.
Okay. And okay, we can finish. There was another question, but don't think we need to talk. It was important to comment on the urge of non-Eurocentric approaches for development. But I don't, if you want to talk a little bit about that. We
talk about what?
Non-Eurocentric approaches to discuss IP public policies, but I think your approach is not Eurocentric. You are always critical, although realistic about intellectual property issues. So that's it. Do you want to talk about anything we lacked or you wanted to talk?
No, but I mean, I've spent most of my career studying even though I'm a man from the U.S. who works in Britain, I've spent most of my career studying the political economy of intellectual property from the perspective of countries of the global South. In terms of the issues that I've always been interested in are how these changes affect those countries, not how it affects the U.S. and Europe, but also in terms of empirically, I do my research mostly in South America and Mexico. And so I'm literally I've always been studying how these issues, looking at this from the perspective of actors in the global South. So I wouldn't say that I have a non-Eurocentric view of this, but I certainly wouldn't say that I have a Eurocentric view of it. My work has always been basically IP from the perspective of the developing countries.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's why I choose you to be my post-PhD supervisor.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to sound too defensive there. It's just I think it's The reason why I'm saying that is I'm articulating a position. Earlier in the interview, I've articulated a position that I think is probably very unpopular and also very uncommon for people who look at the issues from the perspective of the Global South. And so I just, in some ways, I want my track record and background to be on the record.
Yeah. No, I agree. You bring a more realistic view, maybe, because the academy is maybe trapped in this, like, I don't know, intellectual property is bad and we don't need that. And if you get down trips, it's going to solve our problem. And that's not the reality.
I don't know if it's a reality or not. Like, I don't know that I can't say that I know that I'm right. I just think we should be talking about these things, and we should be taking these alternative approaches more seriously. And what's saddened me the most about this whole debate over intellectual property and pharmaceuticals is that it's become so polarized, in which if you support the removal of IP, you're depicted as basically a radical who doesn't understand anything about the pharmaceutical industry and innovation. And if you don't think that the removal of IP is such a big and important step, then you must be basically an ideologue who's obsessed with intellectual property and maybe even taking payments from the pharmaceutical industry. There seems to have been a total lack of dialogue. And so
yeah.
I don't know that I'm right. I just think that we need to be having this discussion about the different approaches.
Yes. Maybe Oxfam needs to build a plant to produce vaccines.
Go for it, yeah. Yeah.
Instead of just like getting you to sign the petition to get down the IP agreement. So.
There's also been a lot of really creative and interesting things going on about IP and pharmaceuticals in Brazil. That's what I thought maybe you're going to want to talk about as well. I mean, more than or as much as any other country in the last year or so, there's been all sorts of stuff going on in Brazil about intellectual property and pharmaceuticals. We could talk about that another time, but it's very interesting.
Okay, so let's set the talk, the dialogue. So thank you, Ken. Thank you for giving a bunch of your time, and I appreciate the dialogue. I think we made it. So thanks a lot to accept the invitation. I'm going to stop the recording right now.
Thanks for including me.
Okay, thank you.